Hello friends. In this episode, we are going to further talk about narrativization techniques used by film editors to narrate a story in a way so that it sounds and looks interesting. Editing, as said earlier, happens at two levels. At the micro level, the editor thinks about match cuts, action continuity, space establishment, and all these things. Once these issues are solved, then the editor takes a macro look at the entire film and does things like parallel cuts, intercuts, and so on and so forth. This makes the edit interesting and the audience is hooked to the story. When we talk about film editing, we essentially mean something is trimmed down from the main body of work. This is an American term. But the European filmmakers use the term montage, which is a French word which means assembling something. So at the macro level, the film editor or the montage artist actually assembles different scenes and makes a story out of it. Let us talk about parallel cuts or parallel editing. When two sequences are playing at the same time at two different places, we have often seen filmmakers use bits of scene 1 and then use bits of scene 2 and develop two stories together. If we take an example from a very early film like The Life of an American Fireman, we'll see the technique of parallel cuts were not used. Although the film director was dealing with something with suspense and thrill, he did not utilize the technique of parallel editing because that language had not yet developed so much. But in a film like The Lone Operator, made in 1911 by D.W. Griffith, we see the use of parallel editing. Although parallel editing was also seen in films like The Great Train Robbery, but it was not exploited as much as it was exploited in this film. In the film The Lone Operator, the scene with the burglars and the woman is parallelly cut with the scene of the people who are coming for her rescue. These two scenes, which were taken separately, as placed together and parallelly, the audience was forced to think that these two scenes are happening at the same point of time. This also created suspense because the audience was anticipating which scene is going to end first. If scene 1 ends first, then the burglars are successful and the rescuers cannot reach the location. If scene 2 ends first, that is, the rescuers finally reach the position or the point where they were supposed to reach, then the story of the film is successful. That is, the rescuers actually rescue the girl from the burglars. So this tension continues till these two scenes merge at a particular point. And that is where parallel cuts end. Parallel cuts are seen in a number of films after that. In the history of filmmaking, we have seen that there are a number of films made by different directors based on the same narrative. Say, for example, a film like Macbeth, which has been made by film directors like Roman Polanski or Akira Kurosawa. We also have an Indian version of the film with the same story. But all these films differ from each other. This difference happens because of structuring, because of how the narration was done. Parallel editing pattern is very unique to cinema. This is something that never could have happened in theater. It has happened in certain cases in theater, but it's not as interesting and as crisp as it happens in cinema, because changing a scene is much easier on films compared to theater. As the language of parallel editing developed, we have also seen the concepts of parallel editing being used in documentary experimental films like Vivan las Antipodas by the famous film director Victor Kosakowski. In this particular film, parallel editing has been done on two locations. One is Shanghai and the other is Argentina. But how are these two positions on the globe related? If you dig a hole from the point where you are standing, you will finally go across the core of the earth and reach another place on the other side of the globe. That is how he has connected these two sequences. If you now connect Shanghai with Argentina, it will be a straight line joining these two places inside the core of the earth. The sequences running in Argentina is parallelly cut with sequences running in Shanghai and gives a wonderful experience for the audience. As the language of parallel editing developed, we have seen wonderful examples, say from the film The Silence of the Lambs. Here, there is a wonderful sequence that starts with the killer who is inside his house and he is conversing with his victim. This scene is parallelly cut with police officers who are covering that entire house from all sides and trying to enter the house and capture the killer. These two sequences are developed step by step. The policemen approach the house and the killer is also established to be within that house space. As these two sequences develop and the police finally reach the calling bell, the bell rings. The killer hears the bell ring and finally opens the door. In a typical situation, this is the point where the parallel edit would have ended and the police must have entered the house and captured the killer. But as soon as the killer opens the door, we see there is a lady who was the investigating officer in this case is on the other side of the door and the killer welcomes her inside. So there is a sudden surprise and the technique of parallel editing has been used. After this scene, we realized that this was not at all a parallel scene. It was a parallel scene in a way, but it's not happening at the same space. So we infer that the police was approaching another house and the killer was actually in another house where the girl entered.
I'm gonna do it, mister! going in.
Good afternoon. Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for Mrs. Lippman's family.
No, Lippmans don't live here anymore.
Excuse me, sir. I really need to speak with you.
What's the problem, officer?
Well, I'm investigating the death of Frederica Bimmel.
There's no one here, Jack. Clarice.
So this kind of surprise has been experimented with in films like these. This is happening because we as an audience are getting accustomed to the language of filmmaking. Parallel editing is one of that. When two sequences play at the same point of time and they are constantly referred back to, we consider that these two things are happening at the same point of time, maybe in two different spaces. Let us now take an example from the film I Know What You Did Last Summer. In this film, we have the space and the time which is constant, but the space has been divided into two parts. One part is where the girl enters the house, and the second part is where the killer enters the house. As these two characters enter, they have two different spaces of their own. The girl is moving around the house, and the killer is also moving around the house. These two characters have independent shots, but since the essence of parallel editing is already inside us, we are feeling that it's happening within the same space. And thus, it is becoming interesting for us to watch that sequence.
And the pitch. Foul ball. Strike two. Last year, Dave, I think he would have been sending that pitch in the next count. It hits the trigger. In the count at 2-2. Bohr hitting 276 this season with 11 homers, but far below his league leading average of 376. We're ahead of the sign out. The ball and the pitch. Very high and very inside. I call that a front bang pitch. I don't know what it is. I couldn't agree with you more as the count is full now at 3-2. Garrett, settle yourself. Looking into the sign. Here's the windup. There's a smash up the middle. Off Garrett's glove, fielded by Scott. They got him. Nice play at second. Wow, what a play. Best in college baseball. That was his surprise or what? I'd say it was beyond surprise, Dave.
As we said, that when we see the two scenes merging, the parallel cutting pattern ends at that point of time. As I have said, that when we see the killer and the victim within the same frame, the parallel scenes merge and it's the end of the parallel cut. What comes next is called intercutting. When these two intense characters, like a killer and the victim, are being shown over and over again, it is called intercutting. Let me give you an example. In a dialogue sequence where two people are talking to each other and the conversation is quite heated, then the editor will go to and fro from character A to character B over and over again. This is not termed as intercutting. Intercutting is only valid when it is done for narrative emphasis. In an example from the film I Know What You Did Last Summer, there is a sequence where the car and the killer inside that car follows a victim. The victim runs in front of the car and the car is following the victim. The sequence more or less starts with a long shot. In that particular shot, we can see the car is following the victim. As far as information is concerned, whatever the director wanted to say is already said. What's left is the narrativization part of it, or building up suspense and thrill. For that, we have quick succession of shots. The shots of the car and of the victim are intermingled and they are cut in quick succession. This is called intercutting. Intercutting is valid when the cut is specifically done by the editor or the filmmaker, so to say, to enhance the dramatics. It is not something that is dramatically evoked like a conversation. So the decisions of intercutting are solely based on editorial decisions. Such sequences generally increases the pace of a sequence. The car, the victim, the car and the victim, and the pace develops. It develops till the point where the car actually crashes and the victim is either killed or saved. We often see that when this kind of intercutting happens, the shot that follows this kind of a sequence is usually long and it holds on for some time. The purpose of using such a shot is to reduce the pace from where it was. This is how films are narrated. Even stories are narrated like this, and cinema follows the same logic. At times you get excited when you're saying something. At times you have a mood which lets you see things in a much slower manner. This is how editing is also done. Intercutting can also be used in a different manner. Like, let's say that it's the same example of a killer following a victim, and we are intercutting between these two shots. Suddenly, the killer shot is replaced by the shot of a lion. This is a comment made by the director, because the director wants to portray or wants to draw a resemblance of a lion with the killer. Although this forms part of montage principles, this is also seen in films, and we have seen film directors use this technique to mean something more than what the images can actually say. Apart from coverage shots, which are used to document what is happening in front of the camera, film directors use certain other kinds of shots, one of them being point of view shots. In a normal situation, the position or the existence of the camera is invisible. That is, when two people are talking, the camera becomes the third person, although the existence of the camera is not there in the scene. A shot is called a point of view shot when the camera assumes the role of one of the characters. When two people are talking, then if a character talks to the camera, then the camera assumes the role of character B. This is called a point of view shot. We have seen this happen in a number of films. Let me give you an example from the film Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa. In this film, the verdict is given by the jury members, and the jury actually listens to whatever the characters in the film has to say regarding a particular incident that happened in the jungle. The jury members are never shown in the film, and the characters talk to the camera instead. This particular treatment makes the audience feel like they are the jury members and the characters are narrating their story. The stories differ from one character to the other, and the audience are in a position to decide which character says the right story.
急に青ざめたその時の女の顔 凍りついたように俺を見つめた何か子供っぽいくらい真剣なその顔。俺はそれを見ると急にあの男が妬ましくなった。憎らしくなった。松の根方に浅ましくくくりつけられた男をこの女に見せてやりたい。その時まで考えもしなかったこういう考えが急に俺の頭に湧いてきた。
Point of view shots has also been used in other films. Let us take an example from the film I Know What You Did Last Summer. In a sequence where the killer is following the girl, we see the shot of the killer and we also see shot of the girl running. This is an intercutting sequence. Within this intercutting sequence, we suddenly see a POV shot of the killer. When we have a POV shot of the killer approaching the girl, in a sense, becomes helpless because the audience can sense how easily and how near the killer is getting close to the victim. When the girl manages to enter the store of her sisters, she then looks at the killer. Again, the director uses a POV shot or a point of view shot. The killer is nowhere to be seen. This also has got a purpose because the girl is in a state of surprise and shock. The girl may not be able to see the killer. Maybe he's there somewhere, but in a state of shock, the girl is not being able to identify that there is the killer standing somewhere outside. In another example from the film Run Lola Run, there is a very strange and interesting use of point of view. We all know that in the film Run Lola Run, a girl is seen running through the city for a long period of time. In some situations we have a topish long shot, in some situations we have a follow shot, in some situations we also have POV shots. In a particular sequence, as the example that we are seeing here, we see the girl is running. This cuts to a point of view shot of the girl. The point of view shot is also somebody running on the bridge in this case. As we see this shot, we suddenly find the girl is approaching the camera, which suddenly nullifies the fact that this was a point of view shot. So these kind of tricks are done by filmmakers in different films. This not only disorients the audience, but also makes the experience of watching this film interesting and entertaining. Editorial decisions are often taken on the basis of sound. Sound plays a very important role for an editor. When the editor has to move from one scene to the other, in most cases, the sound and the image are cut at the same time. In certain cases, these two sound layers are dissolved so that the jerk is not so evident. In Hollywood, we have seen the treatment of an L cut. An L cut is known to have been exercised when we have the image of the previous scene and we already have the sound coming from the preceding scene. In an example from the film Amadeus by Milos Forman, we see that Salieri starts narrating his story from his past. As he's explaining how splendid and wonderful was his music compositions and how well they were appreciated by the audience at that point of time, we see the shot of old Salieri and we already start hearing the sound from the opera house. And then after a few seconds, we cut to the actual scene from the opera house, where we see younger Salieri conducting the opera. This is an example of an L cut. So the L cut can also be reversed. That is, the sound continues and the image from the second scene comes first. It's just a reverse of the previous example. In cases where L cuts are used, we have seen that the transition from scene 1 to scene 2 becomes smoother because the audience is already prepared for the next scene, either with sound or with image, and the transition is not abrupt. The methods of telling stories are varied in nature. Filmmakers are still experimenting with what has been already developed by filmmakers in this more than 100 years of filmmaking experience. People are still experimenting and they are coming up with better ideas to tell a story. In these episodes, we have seen how the film editor works hard to narrate a story. He works hard at the micro level and also at the structuring level so that the narration or telling the story becomes interesting and the audience is entertained. Even if you are not editing a film, it's always necessary that you know these tools, you know the methods of narrativization so that you can at least appreciate a good film editor's work.